In the name of the one and only, we are starting the third session on this particular topic that we started titled When the Prophet of Peace Meets the Prophet of War, an analysis of the hubris syndrome in governance. Let me give you a quick summary of what we discussed in the last two sessions. We talked about why peace is desired, but war is what we opt for in actuality. We discussed why the humankind liked peace, but think war instead. And what is the propensity for violence that persistently defines human culture, if not human nature, although that too is a matter that can be discussed further. We talked about the kind of evolutionary difference, although that may be questioned, in the sense that in the earlier quote-unquote tribal societies, the tribal chiefs had the same interests of survival as the masses, and therefore they often opted for peace, whereas in modern times, due to the elements of militarism and the elements of elections and electability, that sometimes leaders may not appear to be indispensable, and so they try to make themselves dispensable so they can stay in power longer, which is a kind of a negative trend that, while in terms of our intellectual power, intellectual thinking, the human society in generally is progressing hopefully in the positive direction, whereas in terms of governance, at least in this respect, the trend is actually in the opposite direction. We defined the hubris syndrome in the context of pride and arrogance, that it was looked down upon culturally, probably universally. And then we also discussed the addiction to power, how that comes about, and often that it takes about 6 years to stay in power, to become addicted, and then try to stay in power longer by virtually any means possible. and that people who have not developed this addiction, they have not reached that state because they have been in power for rather a short period of time, were happy to leave the political scene once their term of office came to an end. We give examples of Deng Xiaoping and Lech Walesa and Václav Havel, as well as Nelson Mandela, who stepped aside when their term of office came to an end without trying to stay in power. We then contrasted that with leaders who tried to change constitutional political systems in some ways, or at least the formalities of them, so that they could stay in power longer. And we mentioned Vladimir Putin, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, and Robert Mugabe, who tried to become president one day, prime minister the next, and they go back and forth playing musical chairs with the sole purpose of trying to hold on to power for as long as they can. We also mentioned dynastic powers like the Qazzafis and the Assads and the Kims in North Korea, who are kind of ridiculing the concept of presidency, which was meant to end hereditary power, but they have kept the label of presidency and yet are acting for lack of a better term, monarchical in every other sense of the word. We also briefly discussed the element of PTSD, the post-traumatic stress disorder, that as much as it affects the soldier on the battlefield, it would affect leaders in some ways, but because we want to portray them as strong and powerful and symbols of national identity and power and prowess, therefore we do not want to tamper with that national image, and as a result the leaders who may suffer from PTSD may be suffering in the hiding. We then discussed the effect of militarism as to how the industrial military complex has in a way been responsible for militarizing policies, and therefore kind of becoming an element in lengthening political power through the military. In other words, through a collaboration between the militarists and the politicians. This hubris syndrome is fed and protected or supported, although there were individuals that were, let's say, hawks turned dove statesmen, and we mentioned names of Gorbachev and Rabin and Perez to some extent, but that overall they have remained such that the military and the politicians, or the polity in general, have had this cooperation, and we will continue from that now. That we gave you a brief review, perhaps not so brief, but we had to, so that we can contextualize what we are about to discuss. That is the role of the military. The military is glorified and idealized, and the protectors of the homeland, and in all forms of words and terminology that it is supposed to be an honor to serve in the military, because you're prepared to pay the ultimate price, your life. Your life is online for the honor and protection of the homeland. And of course, in this context, we elevate the homeland too. However, when we have to talk about peace, we see that there's a problem with this idealization of the military profession, in the sense that the military is actually incentivized to fight wars. This helps them earn medals, ranks, retirements, benefits. That's what makes them who they eventually become, or what is the goal of a young junior officer, ultimately to have more medals and more higher ranks, on their shoulder, on their epaulette, or in other way, to have more recognition. And the only way they can have such a recognition is to excel in the profession that they have chosen. Let's see, if you have a medical doctor who, just as any human being, wants to excel in his or her profession, a medical doctor would be more engaged in research, in preserving and protecting life, in lingering life, in contributing to the human happiness in any and every way possible, because that's the profession for which a medical doctor is trained. Aside from the fact that a medical doctor as a human being will have some degree of compassion and love for life itself, and therefore, in order to extend life, he or she would have to do everything possible in his or her capacity, through research as well as through practice, to become a better doctor. And a better doctor is one who saves lives. Now, by contrast, a military profession is trained to take life. Yes, the life of an enemy, but life nonetheless. And the more life they take, the more medals they win. And so they can perfect their profession through their operation, which is taking life, actions. And in fact, the word take or take out is a common military expression when they engage in the battlefield. Now, when you take military as a profession, then of course, like every profession, there are elements of incentivizing them, of encouraging them to excel in that in which they are trained, or for which they are trained, and they are trained for killing. And so you probably would not find many generals, 5-star, 4-star, whatever, who have reached that rank without having battlefield experience. And in order for them to have a battlefield experience, they have to have an enemy. And the enemy has to be engaged. And in the engagement of the enemy, you have to prove yourself. And how you prove is to kill. Plain and simple. And so therefore, since the military is incentivized to kill, I'm sorry that I'm oversimplifying this, but there is no other way of saying it. Since the military is incentivized to kill, and the way killing is possible is to have more advanced weapon systems, to use a rather fancier term, weapon systems. Because when you call them systems, they're supposed to be very complicated, and therefore very expensive, and therefore would need a lot of money. And where do you think the money comes from? From the purse of the politician, or at least the politicians who are in charge of our treasury. And so here comes an unholy alliance between, at least in this specific case, between Congress, the Congress and the military, that the idea of war profiteering, that is, the military weapon-producing corporations who work hand in hand with the politicians and with the military. So let's see, you as a citizen, as an average citizen, have some money to invest. What kind of corporation would you invest your money in to maximize your profit? Because after all, capitalism is about maximizing. There's no incentive for welfare, for the well-being, or for the happiness and joy of humanity in capitalism. It's the bottom line that counts, and capitalism can be very easily defined as greed, because if the bottom line is what counts, then the more you have profited, the more successful you are perceived to be. So your success depends on maximizing your profit, and the way you can maximize your profit is to invest in a company that produces a product that brings more benefit. And so therefore the war or weapon producing corporations who produce these complicated weapon systems that cost tens of thousands of dollars per unit can bring benefit to you as an investor, but only if the corporation continues producing it. And they cannot continue producing weapon systems unless the weapon systems that have already been produced are used up, consumed, transferred to other states and countries, often dictators, or simply taken to some battlefield here or there. So, if there is no war, no weapon systems are used. If no weapon systems are used, there is already plenty stocked up. There's no need to make more. When no more weapon systems are made, your investment, your return in a weapon producing corporation, in other words, your profit, will be affected. So therefore, even the average investor is incentivized to invest in the weapon producing corporation to produce weapon systems, and then these plants and factories that produce them are scattered around countries in a way that they happen to fall within the congressional district of almost every congressperson. So when there is time for allocating budget for the Pentagon, every congressperson is incentivized to give their okay for the production of more weapons, because that produces jobs, and so long as the constituents are employed, they will continue voting for the same congressperson again. And so the congressperson has an interest in having full employment in their own district, In the district, you have the factories that produce the weapons. Once the weapons are produced, they have to be sold. Well, yes, we buy some light weapons in our free country that is armed to the teeth, but here we are talking about weapon systems that are usually for the military. And so then we have to create the need for them to be used. And so therefore, the original phrasing in the speech of Dwight Eisenhower way back in 1960, when he was giving his farewell address, was that there is a congressional industrial military complex. That was very correctly identified. However, the word congressional was edited out. And what we heard in his speech was the industrial military complex. And if we had to revise it and correct it, we might as well include the war profiteers, because they are the agents who work both through the Congress in session and the congressional members in sort of retirement, who retire from Congress with a lot of benefits, retirement, health, and all that, huge packages, but then they go right over to the other side and become lobbyists for the same corporations. So while as a retiree of Congress, it's you and I, the taxpayer, who pay their retirement, so that they don't need to work. But then on the other hand, they go back to the other side and work against the Congress, at least in principle, as it appears. They work against the Congress because the lobbyist job is to convince the Congress people to accept and approve certain bills. And of course I'm talking about the ones in respect to the topic that we are discussing, to approve bills that would benefit the weapon manufacturing corporations. And they get paid handsomely there as well. So this is a class of people who are the top manipulators of our society. And that while we have people who sleep on the street, we have homeless, and yet they are working for plans, the health plans, the retirement plans that the Congress retirees have. If they could extend that to every citizen in the country, which they should, because if they call themselves the representatives of the people, then they should do that, but of course they don't. So we are left with breadcrumbs. And the next dimension from which we are going to look at this issue is that of incumbency. Now, if this arrangement that I just described worked so well, then at least from the interest of the militarist, one would argue, well, then why change? Yes, indeed, why change if it's beneficial to them? And so one way to prevent any change, to eliminate change, is to contribute to the concept of the incumbency. Incumbency is when an office holder, let's say for the sake of argument, a congressperson, stays in office and it remains in office longer and longer because of name recognition, and also because it sort of brings jobs to his or her district, partly because of the collaboration we talked about earlier. And so therefore the average citizen in a particular congressional district who could challenge an incumbent, a congressperson already in power, their chance of winning is very, very little. Part of the reason is that what is known as the name recognition factor, which is the incumbency factor, that feeds into the system-wide trend of power manipulation. So incumbency by design is power accumulation and power monopolization. So even the incumbency-centered political process is designed to create the hubris syndrome. This is the main topic we have, and as we discussed earlier, that if a person stays in power for more than 6 years, there is a high probability that that person will get addicted to power and will try to stay in power for as long as they can. In respect to Congress, of course, every congressperson would like to stay as long as they can, but just in case they lose their seat, then they either go to the other side and become a corporate lobbyist, but as long as they can stay in power, sometimes they stay in power through the help of the lobbyist. Not to mention that there are ideas of flag wrapping of the military contractors who in a way are kind of again seen as the protector of the homeland, to see who produces more sophisticated weapons, planes, tanks, armored vehicles of all sorts, and who would again, with the help of the same Congress people, try to bring that to the military, to the civilian use, at least through the police, where unfortunately our police are over-militarized as well. And therefore, those of you who have read 1984 and the idea that the society is moving in the direction of a total control from above, and that total control is not possible unless we have this collaboration between war profiteers, congresspersons, and the militarists, who all benefit from war, and of course from the continuation of the war, and the continuation of any war is contingent upon the continuation of the same policy, the same trend. Now, we call this country, the United States, a democracy. Democracy is a government of the people, and a government of the people ought to represent not only the interests of the people, but that the people would have to be satisfied and happy with the system that is supposedly representing them. In the United States, in respect to the incumbency, 96%, let me repeat that, 96% of the U.S. congressional office holders remain in power. They return to power with all of that. They still have only 7% approval rating. Let me repeat that. 96% of the U.S. congressional office holders return to power. In other words, incumbency, staying in power, is very effective, because 96% of them return to power. And you would think that if 96% 6% of the congressional office holders were returned to power, they would be returning to power with the people's approval, because it's the people who vote them in. But then the paradox comes that the people's approval of the same people who are returned to power. Let me rephrase that the civilians, the constituents' approval of the congressional office holders who are returned to their seats through an election, their approval is only 7%. A major contradiction. And these are figures that were issued by the Center for Responsive Politics. And the percentage for the U.S. Senate is not much different. So therefore, we could easily quote this French axiom, plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose. In other words, nothing really changes much. Now, with the prevalence of this scenario, governance has become a system of denying the citizens of democracy the right to opt for peace. Why? Because, as we said, everything is incentivized towards war. Whether it's the manufacturing of weapons, whether it's the sale of these weapons to the government, our own government in the United States, or governments abroad with congressional approval. And so when there is so much weapon accumulation around the world, and all our military officers are incentivized to go to war rather to keep peace, what should we expect?